Yeah, so I'll do my own bio. My name's Kat Simmons. I am a clinical dietitian. I have been in laboratory diagnostics and education for most of my career. And this topic that I'm going to on today is something that's been an evolution in my experience and something that I feel that there's a lot that is known and then there's a lot of confusion out there. So that was my intention with putting this presentation together today. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we will. Okay. All right. Thanks, Rupa Health, for having me. Super excited to be here today. And like I mentioned, we're going to be talking about testing for gluten immune reactivity and also lifestyle exposure to gluten. And this isn't really a new topic, but it's an important one. And I manage our clinical content for DSL and I do consult on our tests. And I do feel like this is an area where there's quite a bit of confusion. So we're going to run through some FAQs that I get, a lot. And I don't know, hopefully dispel some myths and facts. And I'm excited to see what comes out of the Q&A at the end. With no further ado. So here's some objectives for today's talk. We're going to review some current statistics of just adverse food reactions in general and differentiate between immune-mediated and non-immune-mediated. Our presentation is going to really hone in on the immune-mediated reactions and how to test for them. That's where laboratory diagnostics really shine. And then we're going to talk a little more specifically about gluten and its associated antigenic peptides and proteins and what makes it such an antigenic food in general. And then we're going to review some laboratory testing options for these gluten immune responses. Let's go ahead. I'll move myself out of the way here. So adverse food reactions, this is probably something that is, not uncommon to any of us. It's a frequent topic of patients coming to work with us. And what is that? It's a physical response to food ingestion. And the rates have increased over the past 2 decades. And there's probably numerous reasons for that. It could be politics involving our food supply, but it could also be advanced testing and just increased awareness. But currently about 20% of the population in industrialized nations report adverse food reactions. And about 60% of patients with functional GI disorders, so us coming in with, GI complaints, pinpoint those to food-related symptoms. So it's a huge bucket and a huge conversation. And like I mentioned, these reactions can be immune-mediated or non-immune-mediated. And we're really going to focus on that immune-mediated side today, because that's what laboratory testing is ideally identifying. But this is an important construct to understand, especially as it relates to laboratory testing and potentially getting negative results. Oh, I know I react to such and such food. Why is this test not showing that? It could be exposure related, but there are several non-immune mediated reactions that people could have in terms of carbohydrate malabsorption, even something like lactose intolerance, which is a lack of an enzyme. That's not an immune mediated response. That's the other side of this diagram. This is actually a figure from a really nice 2021 paper in the Journal of Gastroenterology and Hepatology. Check it out if you're interested in it, but it really describes these different mechanisms of action. But today's presentation is really going to be focused on this immune-mediated side. So we're going to dive into that now. And moving into the topic of gluten specifically, let's touch briefly on this, what we call a spectrum of gluten immune disorders, because it really is a spectrum. Celiac disease being the biggest end of the furthest end of that spectrum. We're going to talk a little bit about celiac testing here in a minute, but this is the only autoimmune disease for which a specific trigger has been identified, and that trigger is gluten. And I find that very profound because, as we know, gluten autoimmunity is on the rise, and there's a lot of people struggling with autoimmune disease, and most of us are probably recommending gluten-free diets for most autoimmune conditions out there. But for this to be the only autoimmune condition with an established trigger, and that trigger being gluten, I just find that very profound from a food perspective in general. So there's celiac. There's also allergy, and we're going to talk about that. So wheat gluten is one of the 8 most common food allergies, at least in our country, in the United States, more common in children than adults. That's allergies I feel are less on a lot of our radar in functional medicine, but not that should be the case. It's a big thing that should be ruled in or ruled out, and lab testing can do that for us. And then when we talk about just gut health in general, leaky gut in general, gluten has been identified as a primary driver of zonulin release and intestinal tight junctions. So we know that there's a lot of predecessors to leaky gut. We talk about this a lot, but gluten has been identified as one of these known triggers for driving zonulin release. That's also pretty profound. And then non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So this is probably where we'll hone in mostly, but this prevalence is on the rise, estimated at 0.5 to 13% of the general population, and does tend to be higher in females as well. And I think that's what most of us are looking for in our testing for gluten sensitivity, but it's just one piece of the spectrum. Okay, so this is just some foundational concepts. What is gluten? Gluten is a mixture of seed storage proteins found in grains such as wheat, rye, barley, and oat. Gluten is a large molecule that is composed of, it's a protein, right? But it's a large protein composed of smaller protein fractions, most notably the gliadin and glutenin proteins. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I always like to remind practitioners that in Latin, the word gluten literally translates to glue. And for that reason, it is responsible for a lot of the elastic and cohesive properties of breads, notably, but other grains as well. But glue, and to think about the impact that may have on our digestive tract and digestive function, I think it's a good framework to keep in mind as we're studying this and talking to our patients about it. It's something that you can really get their buy-in when you have that conversation and talk about these literal translations as well. So now let's zoom in a little bit on gliadin. And gliadin, it's a little bit tomato. I don't think there's really necessarily a right or wrong. I typically use the phrase gliadin, but this is a subset of the wheat prolamin protein. So it's a subset of gluten protein. And they tend to have the more antigenic features of gluten. Gliadins are divided into 4 major groups, and immune reactions can actually occur to all gliadin subtypes. So keep that in mind. This is where a lot of emphasis on gluten immune reactivity stems from, because gliadin is a highly antigenic peptide. And it's specifically been identified what's known as the 33-mer, which is basically when you think of proteins, you want to think of essentially pearl necklace analogy, and these are subsets of that pearl necklace. And that 33-mer fragment of gliadin is the most immunogenic fragment of the protein. It is resistant to enzymatic degradation by gastric acidity and pancreatic and brush border peptidases. So I also find that pretty mind-blowing. Stomach acid, pH of 2, can essentially disintegrate a galvanized nail. Can't break down 33-mer gliadin. Remarkable, right? And that's where a lot of this immunogenicity stems from, is that we just don't have mechanisms to break it down. And then what can happen is the 33-mer gliadin binds to these immune districts in the intestinal mucosa intact, and they stimulate this immune system response. I think the 33-mer is the yellow portion of this diagram, but just to give you that visual as well. All right, gluten immune reactions. This is the main focus of this conversation, and we are going to focus briefly on all of these. We are going to certainly talk a little bit about celiac. Celiac is an autoimmune reaction for which gluten trigger has been identified. We'll talk a little bit about the genetics involved in that as well. Wheat allergy, type 1 hypersensitivity, IgE-mediated reactions. And then we're going to also really hone in on this non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which is often abbreviated NCGS. Usually celiac disease and wheat allergy need to be ruled out in considering this sort of diagnosis. And then this can result in intestinal and extraintestinal symptoms, pretty strong prevalence in our country, higher in females. And it's sometimes specified as non-celiac wheat sensitivity. I think it really does. Because of the structural homology, it really stems to all of these gluten-containing proteins. But I do find that gluten-sensitive individuals, in our country, really wheat is the reigning grain that people need to target avoidance for. But all right, this is not a presentation on celiac disease, but certainly celiac warrants discussion. You can't talk about gluten-amine reactions without it. And celiac is something that I wish was on more people's radar. I pulled these statistics from celiac.org. Currently, 1 in 100 people worldwide are affected by celiac. 50% of people who are diagnosed celiac still report symptoms. So that's known as refractory celiac. We'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about our gluten-peptide testing. There is a genetic link and there is a family correlation with celiac. And unfortunately, celiac is a malabsorptive condition. So there is increased risk for comorbid diseases with a celiac diagnosis. And honestly, in my work and my experience, celiac's not tested for enough. And I feel like this is an easy data point that we should honestly be getting on all of our patients. Now, I'm going to be primarily talking about testing from Diagnostic Solutions Laboratory on this presentation. Diagnostic Solutions Lab at this point does not have celiac antibody testing. This is just coming from a place of honesty. There are multiple ways to get celiac testing done. And I would just encourage you to have this on your DDX whenever you're working with complex conditions as they relate to the health of the gastrointestinal tract, but also systemic issues as well. So how do we test for celiac? So blood testing is first line, in my opinion. The tissue transglutaminase 2 IgA antibody is the most sensitive and specific marker for celiac confirmation. This is usually run with a total serum IgA. And this is easy. This is a simple blood draw. And I think it should be done more often than it is. You can also, the former gold standard is the duodenal biopsy, looking for villus atrophy. Used to be considered gold standard. The word on the street now, we say it's like the tarnished bronze standard. It's very invasive. There are site-specific limitations. This villus atrophy that happens in celiac, it does not happen across the board. It typically happens in patches. So if you miss that patch in a biopsy, you're missing the confirmation. You can also run genetics for celiac, and I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. You can. Obviously, symptom assessment should be part of any workup. And then there's just using the clinical response to the gluten-free diet. And honestly, some of the best recommendations out there by current up-to-dates and standard of practice is using what's called this 4 out of 5 rule, where you would look at these 5 criteria. Does the patient meet 4 of them? We can pretty much confirm celiac based on that. Yeah, big deal. I ask this a lot in my consults is, has celiac been ruled in or ruled out? And too often I find that the answer is, I don't know, or no, or it was done 15 years ago and the patient's been suffering ever since and it hasn't been followed up on. Celiac can be diagnosed at any age. If someone got screened in their 40s and now they're in their 60s, it may be time to look again. And testing's gotten a lot better in the past couple decades as well. So a word about celiac genetics, because this is something that we offer at DSL. So HLA genotyping for celiac. People with celiac will carry one or both of these genes. So testing for these genetics can help rule out celiac. By textbook circumstances, you cannot develop true celiac without carrying one of these 2 genes. However, about 30% of the population carries them as well. So it's not a rule in, but it's sort of this, genetic potential. The gun is loaded, so to speak. Anyway, this can help rule things out. I should also mention that on that previous slide, all of the testing I went through does require actively consuming gluten. If someone has been gluten-free for a very long time, usually best practice is we're not going to reintroduce something to their diet. So the genetic testing is independent of celiac consumption. It's also a one-time test. Genomic insight is something that I feel like most DSL customers probably don't even know about. It's a lesser known test on our menu, but it is a comprehensive genomic screen that can be done through saliva collection. We have this kind of cool Opus 23 software, but it does include the celiac genetics. There's many other labs you can get celiac genetics on, but it's a good thing to have in your arsenal when we're talking about this space. All right. All right. So now let's move away from celiac. I'm happy to, answer any Q&As based on that. But again, this was not designed to be a presentation on celiac, but let's talk about testing for these non-celiac gluten immune reactions. And a lot of what we're talking about here is going to be related to antibodies, antibody testing. I think it's a good idea to take a moment and lay some foundations about antibodies in general. What is an antibody? It's a blood protein produced in response to a specific antigen. In this scenario, the antigen here is gluten or gliadin. Antibodies bind to antigens to form what's called immune complexes. And then antibodies and immunoglobulins are somewhat interchangeable terms. So you may hear them used both ways in the literature or even in vernacular. And there are different classes of antibodies, and those classes have different biological properties and they have different functional locations and they offer unique ability to deal with different antigens. So again, this is another fairly broad topic that I'm trying to narrow in on, but it does make a difference when you're talking about testing and defining what antibodies you're testing for. And I just find from experience in talking to people that there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of misused nomenclature. You want to get your facts straight and know what you're testing for when you're testing. In terms of antibody testing, the main things we're going to touch on here are IgE antibodies that are mediated in allergy. And then we're going to talk about IgG and IgA antibodies, which they can give us insight into both systemic immune responses and mucosal immune responses. And we're going to talk a little bit about blood antibody testing and, of course, stool antibody testing as well, which is what's available on the GI map. And one caveat that needs to be understood about antibody testing of really any kind is that antibody testing is exposure based. We talked about celiac. These labs always need to be interpreted in context of the patient's current intake or their timeline of elimination. And that can complicate interpretation, certainly. But typically, if someone has effectively removed a protein from the diet and we're going to run an antibody test for it, you could be prone to false negatives if that elimination has already occurred. Always keep that in mind. All right. So wheat allergy. So this is true allergy. Allergies are typically IgE mediated reactions, and allergic responses typically consist of histamine release from mast cells. And that typically results in these immediate reactions. Allergies are a little bit easier to identify because they are usually typically immediate responses to foods. Wheat, as I mentioned, is one of the 8 major allergens in this country. And as with a lot of food allergies, they tend to be more prominent in children. So about 1% of children in the US have associated wheat allergies. And wheat allergy is one that is typically outgrown by age 12 on average, but that is not always the case. And I feel like IgE testing may or may not be on our radar. A lot of people will refer this out to or allergy specialists and let them figure it out. But I think it is totally appropriate to do IgE workup in most of our clinical practices within our scope. But something else that is important to realize with IgE testing, we use the term sensitization. And so a positive IgE result does not alone diagnose allergy. We would say that would identify allergy sensitization. Allergy diagnosis really needs to be given in context of labs, but also clinical history and symptoms. And, gold standard for allergy is really that food challenge that usually happens in a doctor's office with an EpiPen right there and charged. This may not be as big of a deal in adult populations as children, but I think it's something that we should understand because it is one of the 8 major allergens. And I wanted to take this time to introduce you guys to the IgE Allergy Explorer, which is a DSO offering. And this test is a comprehensive IgE test for including food and environmental allergens. It looks at 150 different allergens at the extract and component level. So, and component testing is pretty cool because it's looking at individual allergen peptides, not just whole proteins. And that can help you determine cross-reactive allergens. It can help you assess the severity of immune response to different foods. That's really important in like peanut, for example. And it can help facilitate better lifestyle management. Certain allergens can be denatured with cooking, others can't. So it can give your patient insight of whether something can be consumed cooked, but not raw. So this is a pretty cool test if you are looking to do any sort of allergy workup. Down at the bottom here are the wheat panel on the Allergy Explorer, but it includes a whole lot more than just wheat. And it is a finger prick blood collection. So that's nice. You don't need to do phlebotomy. And it also includes a total IgE, which is always a good idea for allergy workup as well. All right. So doing good on time. So we've talked about celiac, talked about allergy. Let's move and let's talk about food sensitivities and gluten sensitivity in particular. And so we'll talk about blood testing first. So blood antibody testing. And remember, antibodies bind to proteins to form these immune complexes. And if we have elevated antibodies to foods, this indicates an immune response to food. It's not like it's a physiological part of the digestive process that we develop antibodies to foods. That's not something that happens in normal physiology. If we have antibodies to these foods, the immune system has recognized it, has tagged it, it's on alert for it, so to speak. And I think that is a very important concept to understand. There are various types of blood antibody testing. And honestly, this topic of food sensitivity could be a lecture in itself. When I was prepping for this, if you go to Rupa's library, they have a lot of lectures on food sensitivity. So I would encourage you to check that out. And there's a lot of different kinds of food sensitivity testing out there. You can do blood IgG, you can do blood IgA. There are tests out there that look at IgG subclasses. There are tests that map that next to complement protein. There are tests that do whole protein extract, like looking at extract antigens. And there are tests that use more molecular peptide level antigens. So again, I'm not going to go into all of that. I do want to introduce you to our IgG Food Explorer, which is an IgG test for various foods. But just keep in mind, I feel like it's not always necessary to overcomplicate this. If you have elevated antibodies to a food, that means your immune system has been exposed to those foods and it's tagged them for recognition. There's something off there. And that's really how I kind of conceptualize this in context with patients' intake and their history and symptoms. And food sensitivities are typically delayed reactions. Allergy, on one hand, are more immediate, happening within that first 30 minutes of consumption. Food sensitivity is not the case. And that's what makes them much harder to identify. And that's why testing for them is attractive. Yeah, so I wanted to introduce you to our IgG Food Explorer from Diagnostic Solutions Lab. This is a companion test to the IgE Allergy Explorer, although they can be ordered independently. And it's just a total IgG blood screen for a variety of antigens. I think we have about 184 foods that we're testing for. But specific to gluten, the test does include 14 different gluten antigens, 9 that are wheat gluten specific, and 5 other gluten containing grains. And what I think is cool about this test is that it also includes a molecular antigen for that alpha gliadin, which offers enhanced sensitivity. So again, a lot of these food sensitivity tests are just using extract antigens, which are larger proteins. A lot of times you're going to get enhanced sensitivity by looking at these smaller peptide fractions and immune responses to that specifically. And remember, we already talked about the 33-mer gliadin being the most immunogenic part of the gluten protein. So we're testing directly for that here. So this is a screenshot from our cereal and seed section of that test. And here is that wheat alpha-gliadin antibody specifically. And it's cool. I've seen a lot of tests where this is the only lead antigen that comes back positive, and that's really the benefit here of that testing is it's just honing in on that specificity of that immunogenic peptide. I'm sure that most of you who are familiar with DSL know us for the GI map, and that's obviously our hallmark test. And we're going to move and switch gears and talk about that here in a second. But if you weren't aware, we do have this nice immune response coupling or IgG Food Explorer, IgG Allergy Explorer. They come in the same kit. You can order them as a bundle and you can order them independently, and they are all finger prick micro collection, so no phlebotomy necessary. Okay. Let's switch gears and let's start talking about stool antibody testing, which a lot of us may be familiar with already. And this is obviously what is offered on our GI map stool test and many other commercial stool tests out there in the industry as well. All right. So this is a screenshot of the GI map next to secretory IgA. All right. So I think in order to talk about a gliadin IgA, we need to talk about secretory IgA in general. And so IgA is a mucosal immunoglobulin or antibody. When we think mucosa, we want to be thinking gut, respiratory tract, saliva, tear. Those are the tissues that are putting out these IgA antibodies. So that's how this works. And if you want to follow through with the diagram on the left, and this gets complex, I'm trying to just give you the basics here. So basically what's happening is these plasma cells produce IgA in the lamina propria. The lamina propria is the main site of immune system sampling. That's where survey the immune system, we put out antibodies. All right, now Zoom always likes to get away of what I'm trying to do. All right, plasma cells put out IgA. And it's dimeric IgA. So that little bone, like the dog bone shaped structure, that's essentially two IgA immunoglobulins connected together. And that's called dimeric IgA. And they bind with what's called a secretory component, which is that red S squiggle. And then this complex gets transported across the epithelial. Oh man, I messed that up. Transported across the epithelial cells and secreted into the intestinal lumen. And once it's in the lumen, it can bind to really anything, but the primary things we think of are invading microorganisms in terms of gut pathogens and things like that, but also food antigens, such as gliadin. So secretory IgA is extremely important to our immune system defense, both for infections, but also food sensitivities or antigenic immune response. And I want you to also note and think about this conceptually, that in order for this process to work to its fullest extent and work properly, you need healthy epithelial cells. So if you've got a ton of gut inflammation and leaky gut, or heaven forbid celiac, none of this is going to work properly. So I want us to keep that in mind when we think about these mucosal immune responses to foods, gluten in particular. Okay, so on the GI map, we are measuring fecal antigliadin SIGA. Essentially, it's called antigliadin IgA on the test, but it is secretory IgA. And this is a mucosal response to food antigens, in particular, gliadin. And as we already discussed, SIGA protects us from toxins, infections, other immune system adjuvants, and an elevation of secretory antibodies in stool equates to this, what we call loss of oral tolerance, which is a fancy word for sensitivity. So we use antigliadin secretory IgA on the GI map as a marker of non-celiac gluten sensitivity, which I think all of us understand on the surface, but I wanted to give you the nitty gritty of how this happens and why, just because I think it, as much as this is straightforward, I get a lot of questions that make me think it's not completely understood. So to discuss that, let's hit a couple FAQs, because these questions come up all the time. If you want to nerd out on this anymore, if you're a DSL customer, we have a great DSL Academy learning platform. I actually did the anti-gliadin and IgA module in that academy. So you can get a little bit more on this in there if you want to check that out. But this is a question I get all the time. Okay, do I need to be consuming gluten for anti-gliadin and IgA to be quote unquote accurate? Yes, yes. As we already discussed, antibody testing is exposure based, and antibody testing for foods always needs to be interpreted in context of the patient's current intake or history of intake. That's always my first question when I'm consulting. Okay, is the patient consuming gluten? I feel like a lot of times the provider doesn't know. So that needs to be question number one. And that being said, we often see an elevated anti-gliadin in people who are claiming to be gluten-free. In a way, we can use anti-gliadin as a marker of gluten compliance, but there's some complexities and variability with that. And just to say it, I thought I'd put this in. We as a lab, and I've worked for many labs, a lab is never going to advise people reintroducing foods to get a positive test. If you as a provider want to do that, go ahead. That's your discretion. But a lab is not going to offer that type of recommendation or advice. So when we do get asked that, we say, no, we don't advise that. But again, you're going to interpret the results in context with your patient's diet. Okay. And then this may seem obvious, but I also get this question all the time. Is anti-gliadin secretory IgA a test for celiac, or can we use this as an assessment for celiac? No. The answer is no. We went through the workup for celiac, and I always encourage that workup to be done. We can certainly see elevated anti-gliadin IgA in celiac patients if they're like non-compliant or, still consuming gluten or getting accidental exposure, but that's not always the case. And there is really no literature linking this as a specific marker for celiac disease. It is a marker of gluten sensitivity, a mucosal immune response to gluten, if you will. All right. And then this is the big one. And then this is where I'm going to use this as a segue to the last section of my talk and introducing you into to the gluten peptide direct measurement. But all right, why my patient is gluten-free? Why is anti-gliadin IgA elevated? All right, this is a big question. We could talk about this all day, but I've been doing this a long time, and here are some of the facts. Gluten-free eaters unknowingly consume 5 times more gluten than what is considered safe. And that comes from celiac data. We saw that 50% of celiacs still don't feel good after going gluten-free. Oh, and that's my next bullet. Yeah, 60% of celiacs do not experience complete intestinal healing despite going gluten-free. And that's data that's taken from Marsh scoring and biopsies of celiacs. Long story short, hidden sources of gluten are very common. It is extremely easy to get glutened unintentionally. There was a study done in 2019, and this was pre-COVID, who knows, since COVID times, but it looked at restaurant labeled gluten-free foods. They did an analysis. I think they used one of those NEMA devices to test, and they found that up to 32% of restaurant labeled gluten-free foods were cross-contaminated with gluten. So it's easy. And I'm not here to make anyone feel bad. I'm not here to place blame. This is the reality of the world we live in and why following a gluten-free diet can be challenging. And one other thing I would say is in order for a food to carry that certified gluten-free label, and there's no regulation on this, by the way, so it's like honor system, but it's based on 20 parts per million, at least in America. And that's an arbitrary number. I don't really know where it came from. There could be gluten contamination. I guess point being, people can be sensitive below that threshold, but that is the criteria for carrying that label. And again, donor system. Yeah, we're vulnerable. We're all vulnerable to this. And this is why it can be challenging. The other question we get all the time is, what about cross-reactivity? So there's something here The GI map uses a non-competitive sandwich ELISA assay to measure the secretory IgA gliadin antibodies. And so the sample cross-reactivity is minimized with that testing, but we can't really minimize, the lab cannot minimize the possibility of immune system cross-reactivity. So what is that? That is your immune system confusing another protein as gluten. It is possible. It's abstract. There's not a lot of literature out there on this. There are structurally homologous proteins, so it is possible. But in my experience, cross-contamination is much more likely. So I'm going to breeze through this pretty quick so we've got time for Q&A. But that leads me into, how do we test accurately for gluten exposure? And if you're a DSL customer, you may or may not know, but a handful of months ago, fall, I believe, we launched the Stool gluten-peptide add-on to the GI map. And this can be tested directly, and it's a direct measurement of gluten in stool. As I mentioned earlier, using the antibody testing should be an indication of gluten exposure. If you have antibodies, theoretically, you should be getting exposed, but we already talked about this. The timeline is not very defined. There's lots of individual variation. Think about it. We see negative antibodies in people who consume gluten all day, every day. So that is immune response is highly individually variable. And then there's this kind of cloud of cross-reactivity as well. We were like, let's just take the guesswork out of it. And we adopted this add-on marker, which is, like I mentioned, a direct measurement of the 33-mer gliadin immunogenic peptide in stool. And again, this peptide is resistant to digestion, so it can be detected in stool for up to 2 to 4 days after gluten exposure. There will be some individual variation based on motility and frequency of elimination and that sort of thing. But that 2 to 4 day window is what is captured. And this really is intended to be a test to monitor gluten-free compliance. Doesn't really have a lot of utility if you're eating gluten all the time. It's going to come back positive. If you have those strict gluten-free patients, refractory celiacs, it's a great test to add on to the GI map. You can order it standalone, but most of the time we're going to see it as a GI map add-on. It is a quantitative result. So any result over 5 nanograms would be considered positive for gluten exposure. Tops 2.1, bottom 240, that's tons of gluten exposures. Pretty simple to interpret. It's a pos neg. We're not calling it positive, negative. We do give you that quantified results. And that's a good thing, because I was working with someone last week. Their result was like 40 and they think they're gluten-free. So it's not like that's a fairly minimal amount, but it's still there. It's different than 400. So you can use that quantitative interpretation. And I just thought this was interesting. This is a clinical practice update out of the Journal of Gastroenterology for management of refractory celiac, expert review. Best practice 2 of 10 is to test stool gluten, to a direct assessment of this 33-mer gliadin. You can do this in urine too, not through us, but it is out there. I think there's a direct consumer test that does it in urine. But I think stool is going to be a whole lot more accurate. I actually don't understand the physiology of excreting gluten through urine. But anyway, best practice 2 of 10 if you have these gluten-free individuals that are still symptomatic. So I thought that was pretty profound and a nice adjunct offering to the GI map if you're using the GI map already. I talk to people about it all the time. And just a reminder, how does this compare to antigliadin on the GI map? So the gluten peptide testing is not standard on the GI map. It is an add-on. You got to click that box. It's a direct measurement of this peptide in stool. It detects intake within the last 2 to 4 days. It is a test to monitor gluten-free diet compliance or accidental exposure. So to compare that to the antibody test, antigliadin is standard on the GI map. That is a test to identify an antibody or immune response to gluten, not a direct measurement. It should be negative if the patient is on a gluten-free diet, but we've already talked about all those variables. And I will say too, the antigliadin can be influenced by secretory IgA. So if you have a very low secretory IgA or a very high secretory IgA, that might modify your interpretation of the result because it is a secretory IgA antibody, looking at total blood immunoglobulins against a specific IgA or IgG. Okay, so that's it. I feel like I covered a lot, and I hope that you guys enjoyed that. But just in summary, we talked about immune versus immune mediated responses to food. We talked about gluten, or specifically gliadin, antigenicity. We talked about screening from celiac and the importance of that. And then we talked about lab testing for gliadin antibodies in blood and stool. And then we just introduced you to this stool gluten peptide marker. Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for having me. See you on the other side. If you guys are running GI maps and doing consults or any of our other testing as well, I'm on the phone many days of the week, and in addition to doing a lot of stuff. And you may have seen me on the GI map bootcamp through Rupa. I was on there last week as well. So yeah. Anyway, thank you for attending.
Hi, everyone. We hope you enjoyed this class. If you're a practitioner, make sure you go sign up at rupahealth.com. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.